It's such a delight to look out at all of your faces this morning on homecoming. Happy homecoming, Riverside. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, is famous for many things. One thing in particular is currently housed in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. It's a Bible, sort of. He created it by cutting passages out of a Bible with a razor and pasting them with glue into a collection he titled The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. He took out the parts that he liked best and cut out the rest, making the Bible so much more palatable to him. That's convenient for women who are not silent in the church, say, or for slave-holding former presidents. How nice it would be, I sometimes think, to whip out a pair of scissors and cut out the parts of the Bible that just don't sit well with us. For me, I might choose to cut out our gospel lesson from today. Jesus telling yet another story about wealth and poverty and status and class. You know, Jesus told a lot of stories about these topics in the gospel accounts, but unlike the redemptive ones like the prodigal son, the lost sheep, the lost coin, you remember those from a few weeks ago. Well, the story of Lazarus and the rich man is not about making a mistake, saying you're sorry for your mistake, changing your ways, and being welcomed back home. No, this one is about being rich and burning in hell. See, makes you just want to go find your scissors, doesn't it? This parable of Jesus is unique only to the Gospel of Luke, and it stands out because it's suspiciously similar to popular folklore of the time. In the Jewish tradition and in the culture surrounding Jesus, there was a strong view of the afterlife that was just as it is described here, along with clear and eternal retribution against the wealthy. Morality plays and folktales similar to this one were common. You can find a story just like this in every culture. In fact, do you hear the words of this story and recall anything familiar in our culture? You're right if you're thinking of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. His famous story was inspired, he said, by this parable. And maybe Jesus was doing the same thing Charles Dickens did, telling an old story with a few modern adjustments to make a point. But if that was the case, then we have to ask, what exactly was the point that Jesus was trying to make? Even though we know we're reading some version of a popular morality folktale, imagining Jesus telling it might lead us to believe that Jesus was saying that wealthy people are bad people. Listen to this contrast he paints. The rich man lived a life of excess wealth, going about his business dressed in the finest linen, dyed purple, no less, and feasting sumptuously every day. Those listening to the story would know someone of that social and economic status would live in the lap of luxury with servants to take care of every task and whatever he needed right at his fingertips. And Lazarus, by sharp contrast, was utterly wretched, taking his place in line behind even the stray dogs that prowled the neighborhood at night, sniffing for whatever scraps they could find. And you heard the rest of the story. Both the rich man and Lazarus die, and the tale tells what happens in the afterlife. The rich man burns in hell, desperate for just a drop of cool water on his tongue, and Lazarus is finally comforted in the presence of Abraham and the angels. All those loose ends tied up neatly, with everybody in the story getting what they deserve, right? Well, yeah, unless you're the rich man, in which case you might want to join me with a pair of scissors. Reminds me of a cab ride this summer when I attended a conference in Aspen, Colorado. I told the driver that I was on my first ever trip to Aspen, and he laughed as he told me that 90% of the houses in Aspen are occupied 1 month out of the year. There are two kinds of people in Aspen, he said. People who have 3 houses and people who have 3 jobs. A great divide, for sure. But what about this? Here we sit in one of the richest countries in the whole world, often blind to these appalling facts. Half the world, nearly 3 billion people, live on less than $2 a day. 20% of the population in developed nations consume 86% of the world's goods. And half of the world's richest 1% lives in America. If you make $34,000 a year or more, you fall into that category. In this world, I'm afraid there's no avoiding it. We are the rich man. We are the ones who eat sumptuously and wear fine purple linen. And if these statistics are correct, we are the ones who waste our food and live lavishly while others languish in poverty, pain, and despair. And the bad news for us is it seems like the message of this parable is very straightforward. Rich people are bad and poor people are good. And if you're rich in this life, you're going to burn in hell in the next. See what I mean about scissors? I'm telling you. But Jesus, as we know, is never quite as obvious as we'd like to think he is. So we might need to look a little deeper than this first glance interpretation. Note this: the rich man was not just rich. In that society, he controlled things like land and money and laws and systems and religion. Even the geography of the city was controlled by rich people. The homes of the rich were surrounded by walls and fortifications, and every day they'd let the poor people who worked for them in or not, depending on how they felt. There was a chasm that divided the rich and the poor in life, just like that great divide that Abraham pointed out to the rich man after his death. And the real sin in this story is not necessarily being rich. It's the rich man's unwillingness to bridge the great divide that came between him and Lazarus. His sin was building and maintaining systems that created a chasm that kept the poor oppressed and stuck in a cycle of injustice. Any of this sound familiar? So how can you and I hear this lesson from Luke's gospel in a culture where we own and enjoy so much of the world's wealth? We have no idea how much privilege we have. How can we gain the perspective to see our privilege and wealth for what it really is, and to gather the courage to live with generosity and justice? A clue to the answer to this question is found again in this passage. It's curious that in this story from Luke's gospel, it is only the poor man who has a name. We don't know the rich man's name at all. And while Lazarus is ushered into a community of angels and the presence of Father Abraham, the rich man burns in hell all alone. There was no community to challenge his privilege, to hold him accountable. And this is how we learn to live counter to our culture, with open, giving hearts and lives that stand with the oppressed. We surround ourselves with a community of people who stand with us and help us learn how to live, not with fists clenched and fear narrating our lives, but with open hands and open hearts, using our privilege and our wealth to bridge the great divide. In this very nave on April 4th, almost 50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. voiced the great lesson of this parable. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be beaten and robbed as they make their journey through life. True compassion is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. It understands that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. Right now, on this side of eternity. This week we have all been devastated again by bombs detonated in our own city, shootings in Tulsa and Charlotte, ongoing protests that have gotten violent, and the horrifying vitriol on our news feeds. Donald Trump exclaiming with glee that he predicted the bomb in Chelsea, and Seattle Mariners catcher Steve Clevenger tweeting racist opinions and non-apologies. Our country is poisoned by systems that keep the chasms between us deep and unbridged. Friends, here in America, we are the rich man, and if we keep this up, we are headed straight to hell. I read a story this week by a colleague who lives, as he says, on Jesus' side of the tracks in Charlotte, North Carolina. He recounted this story. His living room was filled with neighborhood teenagers playing cards on a crisp fall evening. As darkness fell, suddenly 2 teenagers from down the street came into the house and said they'd heard gunshots on the street and they were afraid. So they came to the safest place they knew. As the group started playing cards again, they suddenly became aware of a helicopter droning, hovering nearby, and sirens of police cars cruising the neighborhood looking for a suspect. The droning of the helicopter became stronger and louder, and suddenly there was a loud knock at the door. The police explained that they were looking for 2 young men dressed in dark clothes. Persons fitting that description had been seen entering the house, my colleague was told. He writes, that description fit every pair of black men on any street at night, which I now know was the point. He tried to explain to the officer, these children who just entered my house were looking for safety. I know them. I can assure you that they are not responsible. You are in the wrong place while the real suspects are getting away. He wrote, the police and I discussed insofar as you can have a discussion when the other side is fortified by a dozen armed men and a helicopter droning overhead. The course of action was laid out to us this way. The victim of an attempted carjacking was 1 block over in a police patrol car. The 2 young men were to walk out on our front porch, and an officer would drive the victim past our house. Every police car was equipped with a blinding light mounted to the roof. They would stop the car and shine that light onto our boys for the victim to see. He would then either positively or negatively identify them. The boys insisted they had to do what the police said. They were innocent after all, but my colleague didn't know what to do. He didn't think it was smart to let the boys go stand on his front porch, but they were insistent. So he and all of the other people in the house decided that they would go out on the front porch and stand, lined up, shoulder to shoulder with their friends as the police floodlights glared. He writes, when the weight of a system designed to crush people you love is bearing down on your friends, you stand next to them. You become potential suspects, loving accomplices, when the spotlight is robbing them of their dignity, turning boys into men far too young. You keep your eyes open and you refuse to look away. You become party to the crime of demanding full humanity and nothing less. Neither dispassionate analysis or careful moderation or silent contentment or running away or pretending not to see will suffice any longer. It's time to show up, to stand up, to put ourselves on the line for justice. I'm pretty sure that Jesus didn't tell this story recounted in Luke's gospel to say that rich people automatically end up in hell. But hoarding what we have, supporting and perpetuating systems that keep the oppressed crippled, damaging justice-making communities like this one through bad behavior, and living our lives absent of a community that calls us to account for the way that we use our wealth and our privilege will certainly, surely, 100% lead us to destruction. Friends, today is Homecoming Sunday, where we're gathered back again to start a new year of being the community of Christ here at the Riverside Church. Amazing programming is starting up. The choir is back in worship and committee meetings are back on their regular schedules. But I tell you, all of these things, as good as they are flatly inconsequential unless you and I take up the responsibility of reminding each other that it is our shared calling in this world to do justice, to change systems, to recognize our privilege, to open our lives and lavishly share what we have, to live the gospel out loud. If you and I can manage to do that for each other, if this beloved community can do that together, it's then that you and I will finally begin to bridge the great divide. Amen.